The topic for the presentation that I'm going to run through today is wind farms, and just to give a brief overview of what we thought would be useful to cover off in this conversation, in this presentation. To start off with, I'll give a quick rundown of Good Energy and our background and the kind of view that we bring to wind power and its role in the UK. Look at a bit of information around the debate around wind at the moment, which most people are familiar with, particularly from the newspaper headlines that we've seen. And then look at the way that we see it and the opportunity that it provides the UK, and then also the government's plans and its scope for wind, both onshore and offshore in the country. So Good Energy is the UK's only 100% renewable electricity supplier. We're a small energy supplier. We only have about 29,000 supply customers around the UK, so not even one of the bigger suppliers. But we are unique in two ways. First of all, we only supply renewable electricity. And second of all, we do so from small and medium-sized renewable generators. Spread around the country, we support around 35,000 independent renewable generators. We run feed-in tariff accounts, administer paperwork for that, and also through renewables obligation for generators using renewables obligation as well. Of those 35,000, we buy power via contract for roughly about 150 of those larger generators out of those companies, and we get about 70% of our power that way, roughly speaking. Importantly, and I'll touch upon this in due course, we don't just use one technology. We're not technology-centric. We see the role for the full mix of renewable technologies going forward, and how the different characteristics interplay. As a supplier, at the end of the day, we are incentivised by the market structure to be in perfect balance. That is the optimum place to be in, is to have your demand and your supply as equally matched as possible at any given half hour. And the closer we can do that, the better it is for us as a commercial organisation. I'll come on to in due course how we think different renewables technologies help us do that, including wind. And finally, we're the owner of Delabole Wind Farm, which was originally the UK's first commercial wind farm down in Cornwall, North Cornwall. We redeveloped that recently. We repowered it and doubled its capacity. We're also looking to develop in the region of about 40 or 50 megawatts of new renewables capacity in the next 4 or 5 years. Some wind, some solar, predominantly those two technologies, and maybe some others in there too. So we've talked about this, I'm sure, quite a lot already, but just the context here is, of course, is the fact that we're looking to get 15% of our energy from renewable sources in 8 years' time, and that's the obviously European target. We have a committee on climate change targets to cut our carbon emissions by 50% by 2050. It's the two main policy drivers behind wind policy, or renewable energy policy, and wind policy, wind support policy at the moment. But we're lagging behind, which is quite a stark statistic, which I'm not quite sure is used often enough. The fact that only Malta and Luxembourg are below us in terms of penetration of renewable energy in fuel mix. But we, because of that, we have some of the most ambitious targets in the EU as a result. Almost a third of our electricity will need to come from renewables in the future. And the main policy instruments for doing that are renewables obligation and the feed-in tariff. If we look at the current debate around wind at the moment, as I said, most of you will have seen the newspaper headlines in particular. There's been a lot of criticism, there's been a lot of ugly myths which are being pushed by people with certain agendas through the national media narrative in recent months. There's a great little cartoon up there. And the context is, of course, is electricity market reform. The fact that we need to meet those targets and that we're going to have to encourage a huge amount of investment in the UK going forward. And there's a lot of debate in terms of how we do that. Do we do that through nuclear? Do we do that through oil? Well, not oil so much, or coal, but is gas an option, particularly shale? Or what role do renewables play as part of that? As well as that, you factor in the controversy around onshore wind farms in particular. A lot of people resent the idea that a wind farm will be built in our area for whatever reason. And it turns into a fairly potent mix for the debate around renewables, highly emotive. massive opportunity for the UK. We now know that big factor pushing up UK energy bills in recent years has been imported gas. We now import something like 60% of our energy in the UK. Committee on Climate Change Research, we know from an independent body obviously, shows that last summer wholesale gas prices were the biggest upward pressure on energy bills. At the same time, jumping back to the previous slide, there's been a lot of information put out there about talking about how it's been the cost of renewables obligations, the cost of the feed-in tariff, and the cost of renewable subsidies in general. That is pushing energy bills at the moment. But actually, if you look at the research, then we can see here that actually it's our reliance on imported gas, which is in particular, which is causing energy bills to go up. But nevertheless, that in many ways creates an opportunity for wind, because we have a huge amount of wind in this country, roughly around 40% of Europe's entire wind resource. Yet in 2010 we only used only about 3% of electricity came from wind power. So we've got a long way to go, thinking back to that Malta and Luxembourg slide, and we've got a lot of potential to achieve there as well. Cost is also absolutely vital as well. So we talk about the importance of cost coming down, particularly at a time when economic concerns dictate the political narrative which sets subsidies, sets policy. Then there's a need to reiterate and talk about the fact that onshore wind in particular is one of the cheapest renewable technologies out there, arguably cost competitive now with lights of nuclear, and arguably it could reach parity in the next 5 years or so. It varies though due to a number of factors, but the average for a new onshore wind farm in a good location, 3 to 4 pence per unit, competitive with new coal at 2.5 to 4 pence, and cheaper than new nuclear. Those figures come from the Committee on Climate Change, which published a renewables review. So that runs once again over the facts as we see them, and at a time when policy risks being determined by a political narrative which argues that onshore wind is expensive, or wind in particular is expensive, its intermittent nature renders it unreliable and also inefficient. We feel there's 3 key areas where there's need to rebut those claims. As I've said earlier, just now, in terms of cost, we can see that it's one of the cheapest renewable technologies and its costs are still coming down. In terms of intermittency, what we found in terms of supplying our customers, that you can effectively harness wind as a resource to reliably supply our customers, as all energy suppliers are increasingly doing. Intermittency has been proven as an issue that can be managed effectively. In terms of efficiency, the wind turbine generates around 85% of the time. One of the interesting things about the energy debate is that quite often there's a focus on capacity factors for wind, which are in the UK say around 30%. And the assumption is that fossil fuel plants traditionally runs at 100% load factor, which those of you who know about load factor capacity factors clearly is complete nonsense. Gas may only be around 40 or 50%, just to pick one example out. But the interesting point, which I think one thing we'd like to say is that we don't see any one particular renewable technology as a silver bullet. As a company, as a supplier, we're unique in terms of supplying electricity from 100% renewable portfolio. That means rather than turning to buy whatever is available in terms of capacity in the market, we need to think more creatively around different characteristics of it. Our fuel mix is changing all the time with good energy. In the past, we've had about 70% wind, but that's now shifted down to 50% wind of our energy of our electricity comes from wind. And we've seen a big increase in solar in recent years, or in the last year in particular. And the different properties those technologies bring is fascinating. Quite often we find windy days tend to be still days, tend to be bright sunny days, so we find we're getting more power from our solar sites, for example. There's an interaction, there's a clear interaction there if you look at an annualised basis, which basically shows that your wind generation throughout a year will go like this, whereas your solar throughout a year will go like this. And once again, that brings back to the point about balancing. The most commercially efficient place for us to be as a supplier is to be in perfect balance. So wind power is best deployed from our point of view in partnership with other technologies such as solar, marine and marine power. Wind is an intermittent source of generation, can be offset by more predictable sources of generation. With solar, obviously we know when it's going to be daylight roughly and when it's going to be night time, so you can have a greater degree of predictability about it. But other technologies coming on stream in years to come will also play an important role in balancing the intermittency of wind. For example, tidal, we know that we can forecast tidal out to hundreds of years ahead. That predictability is important because that helps us, once again, with our balancing. One thing that we are looking at as a company, first and foremost, we're obviously a renewable electricity supplier. We're not like Res, for example, David's company, which is first and foremost a developer, I think I might say. But we are looking to develop new sites in years to come, and we look at the debate around onshore wind, and we think, in particular, and wind farms in particular, we think, well, what can we do which is different, which tackles a lot of concerns which are out there, a lot of concerns about developers coming in and building sites without consulting properly, without offering some kind of benefit to the local community, although the market started to go that way. And we're one of the things that we view as an absolute in the way that we're looking to develop sites is putting an absolute premium on engagement. So not just doing the bare minimum to get something through the planning process, but going above and beyond that to make sure you've got a proper constructive dialogue with the local community. It's also about, for us, presenting opportunities for that community to invest, say through community bond structure, also provide a community fund which is administered by representatives of local communities. And one thing that we'd like to do in the future is run a local electricity tariff, so local the population can benefit from a discounted electricity tariff run by us as a supplier, which we can do. But unfortunately, the government's plans to simplify electricity tariffs might actually threaten that. There's also that point, of course, about involvement in the planning process. One of the things that we're trying to do is to give people the choice of number of, or certainly give them the opportunity to feed into what they would prefer in terms of number and size of turbines. So when we redevelop our site at Delaware, we go to a community to decide having a large number of smaller turbines or a smaller number of larger turbines. Interestingly enough, they went for the smaller number of larger turbines. Interconnection is an issue which is quite often glossed over in the wider debate around wind. I think it's one which is only really coming into play. In the past, people have focused on perhaps those three things that I put on the earlier slide: cost, efficiency, and intermittency. But interconnection is something we're only really starting to get our heads around, and we're only starting to move forward on in this country. And that can have a huge amount of potential for us as a country, which is to invest in both onshore and offshore wind because of its intermittent nature. It gives the national grid more flexibility as a system operator to balance, and it also presents the opportunity to export as well as import energy as well. That interconnection, perhaps, are equally important in reducing the amount of gas backup that we might see or might need for wind generation by as much as 50%. If you look at the most recent WWF's most recent report, Positive Energy. So interconnection could have quite an important role in that respect. Turning to the UK government's rough ambitions for onshore wind to start off with, and I'll cover offshore wind in a second. This is something that's going to be quite interesting when the renewables roadmap is going to be updated. It'll be interesting to see if there's a scaling back in terms of the scenarios which the government sees for onshore wind, in particular because of the political controversy, particularly when you have a coalition government with Conservative backbenchers for many of whom it is an emotive subject. But at the moment we have 4 gigawatts, and the government sees that under a central scenario tripling to 13 gigawatts by 2020. And one of the interesting things going forward is that if we are going to retain that ambition, how are we going to change as an industry in terms of the fact that many communities might be opposed to onshore wind farms. They might be concerned because of the overall national narrative around onshore wind, which talks about it being expensive, intermittent, talks about the fact that talks about visual impact, which also needs to be discussed and addressed in the planning process. And that's going to be interesting to see how it develops. Looking at key commercial challenges going forward, minimising the investment risk is obviously quite an important one. It's quite an interesting time in terms of what we're going to know for the renewables obligation for its final period from 2013 to 2017. What subsidies onshore wind going to get? Now, bearing in mind now we're less than a year before the 1st of April 2013 when those changes are meant to come in, we're now moving closer and closer to that deadline, and people with pipelines out, with project pipelines out there are getting increasingly concerned that we don't actually have that subsidy yet. reform of the planning system presents its challenges, but also its opportunities as well. The Localism Act will mean that any site below 50 megawatts is subject to a neighbourhood plan from local communities. There's the potential for referenda to be included going forward as well. And once again, the decentralisation of the power of the planning system will require developers going forward to be more innovative in what they're doing in terms of talking to local communities. Radar interference is one issue which I think David might know more than me on this, that Renewable UK has done a lot of work on recently. It's got around a lot of concerns around the MOD in particular, and also Civil Aviation Authority. Cost-effective grid investment and connection is also key here as well. Grid connection is an issue which is increasingly a concern, I think, for all renewables developers, whether it's solar, whether they be wind, onshore wind. And it'll be interesting to see, given the cost of grid connection is increasing, or certainly the costs are high, whether you will start to see more dual technology sites going forward, whether you start to see more sites with wind and solar. So I don't know if anyone's been to Western wind farm near Swindon. It's a great site where they've got, I think it's 5 megawatts of solar on site, with I think 10 or 13 megawatt wind farm as well. So you can see developers look for economies of scale in that respect. Turning to offshore wind. Offshore wind is clearly UK has huge potential in offshore wind and is really seeking to be the global leader in many ways. Other countries are starting to look that way now. Germany particularly close out of their nuclear, but other countries like Denmark as well, which is now I think going for 100% renewable target, all see offshore wind as an area for growth in the future. But it's an area where we are genuinely leading the way. And if you consider the UK's relatively poor record in the past on renewables, that's very valuable to us. The government's renewables roadmap once again forecasts that up to 18 gigawatts can be deployed by 2020. Whereas a lot of the costs around offshore wind tend to be more, a lot of the challenges tend to be more cost related than onshore wind. The government has introduced policy objectives to, I think, get the cost of offshore wind down to £110 per megawatt hour by 2020. Given the relatively immature state of technology versus onshore wind, then the scope is there more so for making cost reductions, but clearly those costs are higher in the first place. Supply chain is a big part of that, and investment risk as well, once again. The ability to access finance, the Green Investment Bank is going to be focused, one of its priorities will be offshore wind going forward. And issues around grid and grid investment are perhaps even more pressing for offshore wind, because you're looking at a change in structure of our grid from a system where national grid runs down the spine of the country to a system where you need to have a transmission network which takes into account for the fact that a considerable amount of generation, large-scale generation, will take place around shores. Planning and consenting with a lot longer lead-in times as well. Whilst not as controversial for offshore wind, the process takes a lot longer for offshore wind. Any questions?
Really refreshing to hear I'm Stuart. Really refreshing to hear a robust defence of wind power. Some of the coverage has been hysterical. The latest one suggesting that wind power causes global warming.
Yes, that's right.
Which is pretty crazy. One comment and a question. Comment, I did a bit of filming recently, and part of the research beforehand, we did interview 10 people about film so they could be relaxed. And it was really, one wind turbine took 3 years to get through planning and drawing board. It was really a sense of a before and after.
Yeah.
And we talked to people who actually went up there and actually asked them what their views were before and what they were now. they themselves, in their strategy and approach, have actually kept the price of renewals, particularly when high. I wondered if you could make some comments on that, since you're brief on that.
It's quite an interesting one. I haven't actually heard that one before. I think particularly the interesting thing about that is if you're talking about reducing the cost, and as I said in the presentation, the area where there's greatest scope for cost reduction is the offshore wind sector. But the interesting thing about the offshore wind sector is that the onshore wind sector, with the exception of Good Energy, RES, and various other few other players, there are far more independent or non-big six players in the offshore wind sector. So I think that's probably worth bearing in mind in that respect. I think at the end of the day, their investments are going to be linked in certainly short to medium term to any subsidy. That subsidy is going to be determined by the political debate, which dictates not policy at the end of the day. So if they are taking that approach, then they are going to be shooting themselves in the foot in terms of not bringing the cost down. So it's an interesting one. I haven't heard it before. But I mean, as you would expect an independent operator to say, the key to any to tackling any problem like that is just have more independent organisations involved, more independent developers involved, to ensure that sort of behaviour which might be linked to a vested interest is minimised and the impact of that is minimised.
CPRE in the shape of Bill Bryson sort of expressed concern about wind farms. Has anyone asked them what the alternative would be? Because if they go down the shale gas route, they would have thousands of wellheads all over the UK, toxic ponds, dangerous to animals and humans alike. I mean, what are they thinking?
I mean, that's a question I have to put to Bill Bryson himself. I mean, the interesting thing about that report is that it kind of feeds the impression, or it's trying to feed the impression that wind farms have been built left, right and centre, and that there's this huge density of onshore wind farms now. You look at a situation where planning approval rates have fallen to 26%, I believe it is, for onshore wind. So the planning system is stopping sites getting developed, as I said before. Clearly there's a need to be sensitive. There is the possibility that a developer might go to an area where it is a site of special interest, and then it does need to be discussion whether it's appropriate for that area, absolutely. But in terms of that wider narrative and the wider debate, there is a risk, I suppose, of playing to the wider hysteria, playing to the crowd to try and push a point.
One wonders if windmills would ever have been allowed in the UK.
The interesting thing about shale gas as well is that no one actually knows what the shale gas potential is in the UK. So you're talking about moving to a situation where you have one renewable energy resource where you know what it is, you know its capability, you know its cost, you know its downward cost trajectory, you know how to manage it, to something which is massively uncertain. You don't know how much we've got of it, we don't know what the cost is going to be of it. It's going to continue to emit CO2. And it's very short-term logic, if there is any logic there at all. The phrase that we use is that every pound invested in wind is a pound invested in perpetuity, but every pound you invest in something like shale gas, for example, is at the end of the day a pound is going to have to be written off one day or another. You look at UK Oil and Gas's website, the Trade Association's website, they've got lots of pages on their decommissioning.
Thank you. David Hackman, right. I just wanted to, as is evidence in my position, and I just wanted to find out whether you have a perspective in terms of the negative press on renewables feeding through in terms of your customer demand and your customer base, whether you're going to be factoring that.
That is interesting, actually. Our supply base grew, our supply customers grew by 15% last year. So we're growing. Our customers seem to like us, and we seem to get new customers. The interesting thing that we can talk about as a supplier is that we've now frozen our prices. Our prices haven't changed since 2008. So we've gone from having been a premium supplier, providing a premium product, to actually we're cheaper than the average Big Six standard tariff. So we've gone from one to the other. And we naturally like to talk about how that is using renewables to deliver more price stability. Which, if you look at the research, I think a lot of stuff, a lot of focus on the fact that only 40% of people are switching electricity supply is actually what we would argue is an endowment of the fact that you have a market which encourages purely on price level. There's no innovation beyond price level in the market. You've just got to look at the technology in your electricity meter, better technology in your mobile phone, to see how we have all these, in essence, a very dumb market in many ways. So there's no ability for people to control their costs, there's no ability for people to manage their energy usage, and therefore thinking more innovatively around it. But just really to my point around price level versus price stability, I think renewables have a strong message to push in terms of price stability at a time when energy bills are one of the biggest upward pressures on inflation, and obviously it has an impact in terms of business. If you're a business you're looking to invest, then how can you have any certainty to invest and grow as a business if you don't know what your energy bills are going to be next month, because then you've got X thousand pounds less to invest in something else. So I think there's those kind of messages and something that we as an industry are starting to talk about a lot better, actually, I think. And yeah.
Did you have a question?
Please.
Sorry. Just begin.
Hello, Stephen Scriven, Site Technology. I frequently give lectures on what the house of the future would look like. One of the things I go through with the students is basically why most renewables don't actually make any commercial sense. Now, my reading of the information on wind is that it only works about 20% of the time in the UK, 18% of the time in Germany. So you have to have a full backup system in place, which is also horribly expensive, or else you get gas turbine backups, which is also expensive. Try as I will, I cannot see how anyone can make commercial sense of something that only works 20% of the time. I know the politicians like it, but my question to anybody who looks at renewables is to say, you're standing outside on New Year's Eve, it's coming up to midnight, you look out across the steel bay, where's your renewable coming from? It's not coming from the wind, it's not coming from the tide, and it's not coming from the sun. And as soon as you duplicate by having a backup, all your cost and analysis, lifetime cost analysis, lifetime energy analysis goes out the window.
I think the interesting thing, well, first of all, the capacity factor for wind in the UK on average is about 30% rather than 20%, so it is quite a lot higher than that. I think the point often missed around that as well is that fossil fuel plant is never 100%. So gas or coal will be, or gas will be around 40 or 50%, will only be running half of the time as well. So any plant that you have is never going to have 100% capacity factor. Generally, I think even if you look at nuclear, for example, which has quite a high capacity factor, it still has it still has to shut down quite often for long periods. I think Sizewell B has just come off a period where it's been shut down for a period of time. In terms of managing intermittency, I think interconnection has a role to play in there. I think storage. I think the issue that you're touching upon is storage, and if we can crack storage as an industry, that is an absolute killer. That's the closest we're going to get a silver bullet at the end of the day. So I think on-site storage is going to have a really important role going forward as well. So it's an innovation part of it as well. I mean, the other point I find to make as well is that the cost of gas backup isn't going to be, I don't think it's going to be huge. I don't think it's going to be, I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but I don't think it's going to be to the point that it completely blows renewables out of the point, out of the water, the economic case for them. And of course, the final point I would make is at the end of the day, every single kilowatt or megawatt hour of electricity you're generating from a renewable source, that is zero carbon, and that is offsetting the need to generate some electricity from carbon and fossil fuel based plant. So clearly there are challenges to be overcome, but I think storage is going to have a really important role in that side of things as well.
Well, it's just that I've looked at the German literature on wind turbines, and when you take the full life carbon or cost analysis, it comes out about twice as expensive, more than twice as expensive as burning coal. So you have to persuade the population who's happy to live with electricity that's double or triple its current price.
But that's in the short term. And then you factor in the fuel price for coal now as well, because that's only going to go up.
Well, I'm just looking at the latest data that was published a few weeks ago. But
I haven't seen that particular paper, but clearly you're removing a fuel source there as well, and that's if you look at, for example, the case of Spain 2 weeks ago, I think on one day 60% of their power came from wind. It ended up depressing the wholesale price of electricity as a result. So it has a role in that respect, but it's dependent on the fuel source. I mean, because at the end of the day, fossil fuels are going to run out at some shape or form, and it depends on the cost of the technology and also developing technology in terms of physical development, in terms of deployment on the ground, coming down as well. Clearly, there are a lot of efficiencies that still need to be made there, but they are being made at the end of the day. And the final point about fossil fuel plant in relation to subsidies is, when was the last time we built a fossil fuel plant in this country when the electricity system wasn't nationalised? Because everyone talks about subsidies for renewables, but actually most of the fossil fuel plant we have in this country was built when the system was nationalised as well. Which is
I mean, new coal-fired power station, there's a thing called the low carbon economy coming up, Mr. Swindon, you may not have heard about it, but they have to be fitted with carbon capture technique, and that's going to shove your price up as well. So I don't think there's any cheap fossil fuel options, there aren't.
Yeah, but
Not for new build.
the carbon capture technology doesn't work.
Of course it doesn't, but that's why it's
So-
more expensive.
Roy Wagner, Aegis Energy. I think perhaps a way to understand wind energy is that wind farms are spread all over the place. So maybe one sector doesn't have wind, but there are other sectors that are continuing. So there is this sort of evening out of the supply.
Yeah, it is a more
Yes,
decentralised
so I
approach,
think you
yeah.
have to, it's an integrated system. So sectors may not be working for the other sectors.
Absolutely.
There was a meeting, funny enough, Saudi Arabia looking into renewables, and I was invited to discuss this. And one of the guys from the MIT was talking about sodium cells that they're developing, and they reckon that will support wind energy significantly.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the points, and I'll keep my remarks brief because I've got to rush, but